Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. Today I want to share a few of my favorite photos from the Galapagos as well as the stories behind those photos. And even if you're never going to go to the Galapagos, the tips, the advice, the techniques, all of the fieldcraft that I use for those photos, I'll tell you what, it applies all over the globe. So no matter where you do your photography, the advice in this video is going to prove invaluable. So make sure you watch it all the way to the end so you make sure you kind of grab all of those hidden gems. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So starting off strong with one of my favorite shots from the trip. This was actually on our very first morning. We had been there the day before shooting tortoises in the afternoon, but this was our first morning out. We were on the Zodiacs and we found these sea lions. This was definitely one of the highlights of that morning, but let me tell you, that was like one of the best photography mornings of my life. But one of the highlights was definitely when we found the sea lion and he was playing with this blowfish, with this pufferfish, and he was tossing it around. And it's not because he was trying to eat it. It looks like he's about to chomp down and have that for a snack. He was not trying to eat it. They're toys. Pufferfish are toys to sea lions. They're poisonous to sea lions, so they won't eat them, but they do kind of inflate and blow up a little bit when they're scared. So they find them and then they turn them into little balls they can play with, as you can see here. And that's basically what he was doing. However, he wasn't just tossing it up and down. He was throwing it and chasing it and going after it. And this was extremely lucky. This shot was lucky for a lot of different reasons. So we'll talk about that. Number one is that I was in a good spot with the Zodiac, which, you know, that's position is everything. So thank you to my Zodiac driver for that. The other thing is that, again, he's not constantly tossing this fish. So this was just, I happened to catch this shot before he grabbed it again and tossed it someplace else. So that was very, very fortunate. I also like that it's in his whiskers there. I think that's really, really cool. And this was a little bit dangerous though. I made one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they first get on a trip and they're excited and they're shooting and they're not looking at their settings, because I almost blew this shot. It was this close. If you look at the settings here, you can see that I was at 1/1250th of a second at f4 at 125 ISO. And the truth is, for an animal that's active like that, 1/1250th of a second was a little slow, but I was so excited I didn't look. So sometimes I make mistakes too. Fortunately, I got lucky. I'll show you here in Lightroom. And if we zoom in, you can see that that is nice and sharp. That is a 200% zoom in there. So I got lucky that I was able to get a nice sharp photo of the sea lion throwing this up in the air. And I think I must have caught it just as his head was stopping and getting ready to move again. I caught it at that little moment where it stops for an instant before it changes direction. So very lucky. But I should have been at maybe 1600th of a second at ISO 125. I had plenty of space there. I could have been at 1600, could have been at 2000. But unfortunately, I was too busy playing with the sea lion. So it pays to keep an eye out, but sometimes you just don't get lucky. F-stop was f4. Not a big surprise there. I would have left that alone either way. And again, ISO was 125. One of the tricks here was I was against a fairly bright background, so I added 0.3 EV to the exposure. Probably could have even gone 2/3 of a stop because later I did have to bump this up. But I'm always protective of those highlights because I don't want to blow out highlights. For example, if we go over here to Lightroom, you can see over here, this back area here could have very easily been clipped had I been pushing that a little bit too far with my EV. I'm always happy to be a little more under than over. The other trick with this, of course, I was shooting from a Zodiac. And one of the things people don't realize when you're shooting from a boat, there's two big rules. Because the engine's usually running in a situation like this. So there's two big rules. Number one, make sure you have enough shutter speed. Again, I kind of blew it here. I should have been maybe a little bit faster. But ideally, you want to be at least 1,000th of a second or faster if you have a motor running on a boat. And ideally, depending on how rough that motor's running, it's better to be faster than 1,000. 1,000 is like the bare minimum. The other thing is you don't want the camera to be touching any surface of the boat, even on a Zodiac. Because you might think, oh, well, those rubber, gunnels there, you put that right there, it's fine, it's, nice and soft. It's still vibrating. All the engine vibration is getting transferred. So you want to put your hand between the camera lens and the camera itself and the boat. You don't want the camera touching any part of the boat. You want to cushion it with your hand as much as possible. And one more tip here as a bonus for boat shooters is to get as low as you can. So I am just above the gunnel on this. Matter of fact, there were a couple of times I was actually leaning out over the side and using the LCD. This may have been one of those times. I can't really recall, but it is a nice low perspective. You can see that I'm a little bit lower than the sea lion in the shot, which is exactly what I want. So that worked out really, really well. But lots of tricks to shooting on boats. So hopefully that helps you if you ever find yourself on a Zodiac or any other kind of boat. Okay, I really like this one. This was Another stroke of luck. A lot of times we make our own luck, but sometimes, you just do get lucky out there in the field. And basically what happened was this. We were out just kind of doing a dinghy ride looking for wildlife. And when I looked to the other side of the channel we were in, there was this rainbow forming. And we saw these frigatebirds flying in front of it. And unfortunately, from where we were, it was just too far away. They were little tiny, tiny specks in the viewfinder. You couldn't tell what they were, even with super heavy cropping. So I was thinking, you know what? We need to get closer because we could get a frigatebird with a rainbow behind it. And as you can see, we're successful with that. So what we did is I talked to the driver. We went all the way across the channel to get us a little bit closer to the frigatebirds. Now, unfortunately, that does not magnify our rainbow for us because as you move, rainbows move with you. If you've ever gone after a rainbow to try to get to the end of it, you know that it keeps moving away. So it wasn't going to magnify the rainbow anymore, but I didn't really need that. I didn't really need more magnification on the rainbow. What I needed was more magnification on the birds. So by getting a little bit closer there, I was able to get the bird large enough in the viewfinder that when it went past the rainbow, you can actually tell that we have a male frigatebird here and not some little speck of dust on my sensor. So that worked out really well. He was still pretty far though. You can see I was using the 300-2.8 with a 2x teleconverter for this shot. So I'm at 600 millimeter, which in the Galapagos, that's kind of a long lens. 3200th of a second, which is my typical go-to. I stopped down to f6.3 instead of 5.6 on this one, just to get a little extra sharpness out of that combo. ISO was a nice 800, very easy to work with. I didn't have any EV dialed in. There were some great clouds and stuff behind it. I probably could have gone like plus 1/3 or maybe even plus 2/3, but it looked pretty decent in the viewfinder, so I just brought the exposure up just a little bit in the final exposure when I was in Lightroom. So not a big deal there. But the big trick here was trying to get him in front of the rainbow. So we're in the boat and we're waiting for the bird to pass by the rainbow. And the problem is if you're down here with your camera and he's passing in front of the rainbow, you've missed it. But the other thing is if you're following him, you don't want to just take photos forever until he crosses the rainbow. You could, but that's, you're getting a lot of shots of him up against a gray sky that you're just going to have to throw out. So what I did is, and I'm not super good at this, but it is something worth practicing, is I kept both eyes open. So I had one eye in the viewfinder and I'm watching what's happening in there. I'm keeping the bird centered up in the frame. And then I'm watching where he is in relation to the rainbow with my left eye. So I have my left eye open and I'm watching him as I'm panning. And as he gets to the rainbow, I just lay on it. I'm doing 20 frames a second because I want to make sure I have him in an exact right spot. I want some wing position options. If he happens to be flapping, they were mostly gliding, but every now and then because they were a little bit lower that we were getting a few flaps. So I wanted to make sure I had everything just right. And I wanted him more or less centered in the rainbow with a nice wing position. So again, high frame rates. Probably could have even bumped this to 30 frames a second with my Sony A1 Mark II. But I was at 20 for this one. I think it was adequate. But anyhow, it worked out really well. But sometimes you see an opportunity and you do have to make a few adjustments in the field in order to realize the potential of that opportunity. Had we just stayed way back where we initially saw them and just fired away, we would have had little specks in there and it wouldn't have worked out. By getting closer, we were able to get the bird larger in the frame and we had this beautiful rainbow in the background. This shot was, 80% luck and 20% preparation, or maybe 20% luck and 80% preparation, depending on how you want to perceive it. So basically what happened, this is Kicker Rock. This is a rather famous formation there in the ocean, their island there in the ocean. It doesn't really look like a typical island, but it technically is an island. But it's very famous in the Galapagos. And we were on an adjacent island and we were photographing various things there. And we saw this great blue heron just kind of sitting there with this to the right. And I thought, oh, what a great composition that would make. And I needed to get up to take a photo of him. I needed to get a little higher because I was a little bit too low. And unfortunately, I did not have any shoes on. We were on a beach. So I couldn't walk on the lava rock barefoot because I'm kind of a wimp. So I went back to get my shoes and I was putting my shoes on and I grabbed I had the camera, everything. And as I'm walking towards the position where I need to shoot, this guy is starting to squat. And if you've done any birds, you know what that means. They're thinking about taking off. So immediately I'm looking at my settings as I'm walking up to get into position here. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to need more shutter speed. I definitely want to drop my f-stop so I have a little more depth of field, so I have a little more detail on that rock and the clouds behind him. And I'm walking up, I'm getting into position, and just as I get in position, he starts to squat down again. I make a quick composition thinking, okay, I need to make sure I have some space between him and the rock when he takes off. I want to include the top of the cloud and all of that stuff. So I'm in position there, and just as I get everything composed, he's squats one last time, and then he bursts into flight there. So in this case, I was actually very prepared for the shot, and I think it worked out really, really well. I really like that composition there. I like the fact that he is taking off, and we have this nice balance between him and the rock, and there's these nice clouds up here, and you can see the lava rock. It tells a nice story of the Galapagos, and a lot of times that's what I'm trying to do when I'm at these various locations. I don't want to just document a shot. I don't want field guide shots. I want shots that kind of tell a little bit of a story about the location. And this worked out really well. Going to settings, we were at 1/2500th of a second, f10, again for the depth of field. ISO was only 640, and that all worked out really, really well for me, and ended up with this shot. Next, we have this short-eared owl, and honestly, I did not know there were short-eared owls in the Galapagos, but here they are. And they're living in these volcanic rocks, and it's absolutely fantastic to see them there. They look like they're in like an alien world or something. It's really, really neat. But this guy was in basically what was a lava tube. It kind of collapsed, the top of it collapsed, so it's more like a lava slot canyon. But fortunately, where he was on the rock wall was more or less level with the ground where we were able to shoot across. So this worked out really well. So the way I did this though, normally you can see that the ground is right here. So normally, you think about getting down on your belly or something, because I always like to get low. I like to get to eye level. If you've watched any of my videos, that's a thing with me. However, the problem here and in a lot of places in the Galapagos is there's lava rock everywhere. And honestly, if you get on your belly in lava rock, you're probably going to have to make a little bit of a blood sacrifice. Okay. So what's the trick here? Well, this is where modern technology really comes in handy, because our modern mirrorless cameras have phase detect AF right on the sensor. So what I did is, here's my setup here. No teleconverter on this, but just pretend there's one there. So basically what I did is I held the foot of the lens, and I use the rear LCD with subject detection to stay on the eye, because I am trying to hold this camera just at the exact right height. Because if I'm too low, if you look at the bottom of this, if I'm too low, I'm going to get this blur up by his feet, and that's no good. We don't want that, or worse, by his face. So I can't go all the way to the ground, but if I go up too high, I'm going to lose that eye-to-eye contact there. So I had to keep the camera just in a perfect position there. I'm squatting down, and he decides to stretch his wings. And thanks to the eye tracking, because his head was up in this area right here, and thanks to subject detection, it just followed him all the way down as he squatted there, as he bent over to stretch his wings. And I love the way this worked out, because there's so many V's and triangles in this. One of the compositional tools they say to sometimes use are triangles. And if you look, you can see this is forming a triangle. His wings are forming a triangle. This is forming a triangle right here. You see a lot of them in here. So this is just full of triangles. And even the foreground vegetation is kind of in a rough triangle V shape here, which honestly, I just really love how this worked out here. I did have to come in afterwards and do some post-processing. I lightened his face up maybe by about a half a stop, because it was a little bit shadowed in there to make it stand out a little bit more. But for the most part, that's, wasn't much to it. This is a square crop because everything to the left and right was just kind of blurry and didn't really add anything to the photo. And I really like kind of the centered composition here. Anytime you have an animal that's facing straight at the camera, you can start thinking about a centered up composition. If it's looking a little one way or the other, I like to kind of move it in the opposite direction that it's looking. But a shot like this where he's right down the barrel of the lens, I don't mind it right in the middle of the frame like that. As far as settings go, this was the A1 Mark II at 420 millimeters. So that was my 302.8 plus my 1.4 teleconverter. And 12/50th of a second, because he's not moving that much. I just needed enough to make sure that when I was hand holding it, that I was arresting the motion, and any motion that he was making at the time would be good. So 1000, 1250, 1600, any of those, very, very safe. ISO was 1000, so low enough that I was able to, keep it nice and clean. And let me show you here. I'll zoom in to 100%. You can see, with a little noise reduction, this looks great, and it's nice and sharp. You can see every little detail around his eyes, around that orbital ring there. So basically that's the shot, and it was a lot of fun. So let's move on. Next, we have these two flamingos. These are juvenile American flamingos, and they were just kind of hanging out on the beach when we found them. In fact, when we pulled up, they were more or less sleeping. Matter of fact, I think if you watched my other video, I was talking about what's in my bag, Galapagos edition. I was talking about an incident where we had the Zodiac kind of get flooded by waves, and I was really glad I had the backpack. I think this was the day that happened. The waves were really rough, and my waterproof backpack sure came in handy, but I'm telling you that because I'm building up to something here. So anyhow, for the most part, when we got there, they were just kind of had their eyes shut. They weren't really doing much. They'd look around and maybe walk a few feet here and there, but that was about it. And then they got a little more active, and it was kind of fun because they would go down and they would kind of filter out the water as it was washing up on the beach. And once again, I'm dealing with a very low perspective here. So for this shot, what I did is actually was on my belly because I wanted to kind of follow them along a little bit better than I would with maybe an LCD. So I was on my belly, I had the camera to my eye, and the reason I mentioned the waves is because there's a couple occasions I'm down there on my belly and a wave comes in, I have to get the camera way up out of the water before it got splashed because it was, kind of washing over me there, or trying to anyway. So, you definitely have to be very, very careful in these kind of conditions with your camera gear and make sure that you're keeping it out of that water and be very aware of those waves as they're coming up. For the most part, I wasn't surprised by the waves. I just couldn't get out of the way fast enough in a lot of situations. I saw it come. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get the camera up out of the way. It's going to hit me. It's hot. It feels good. What the heck? But going back to this shot, I really am glad the way this turned out. I was kind of lucky here because I was at f2.8, and ideally with more than one subject in the frame, you maybe want to be stopped down to f8, f11, something like that. And even that, unless they're very close to the same focal plane, you're not going to get them both sharp. In this case, I was able to get both of them sharp. They were on the same focal plane, and I was at 2.8, so that was a nice bonus there. So you're probably wondering, well, why were you at f2.8 to begin with, right? So the main reason was, prior to this happening, and this took place over the course of 2 seconds. Prior to this happening, I was just basically doing portraits of them. And I was stopping down to f2.8 because I loved the way the background looked. I had been shooting at f4 to 5.6, and the background was starting to compete a little bit with my subject. So I thought, let me stop down to f2.8 so that the subject is standing out. It's popping out from that background a little more. I really, really like the look of it. And of course, as soon as you do something like that, you get an interaction like this. But this worked out really, really well. I was lucky they were on the same focal plane. And as you can see, plenty of shutter speed at 1/4000th of a second. ISO is all the way down to 160, so not much there. This was just the straight 300 2.8. And I had multiple poses of this. Again, it only lasted, a matter of seconds, but it did, I did get some nice poses here. And this is the one that was my favorite, though. I really like that this guy got his neck all stretched out. You can see his intent is definitely his friend right there. I also like the repetition of their feet. Their feet are almost in the exact same position, and both of them have a little splash coming up. But if you look at this guy here on the right, look at his legs. His legs are crossed. It's absolutely clear, and you can see his body's leaning towards the right. It's absolutely clear that he was trying to get away from his little friend here because he was worried his friend was mad at him for something. I don't know. I don't even remember what caused this incident, but I'm glad that happened. I really, really like that shot. I think it's a very, very interesting take there. And it shows you a few other things too. This was taken maybe 2 hours before sunset at the equator. So the sun's up pretty high. And one of the things I tell people is when you're dealing with harder light like this, if you're in an area where you get a lot of reflection, where you have water and sand and things like that, a lot of times it doesn't look as bad as you think it's going to, because when you're in hard light, the enemy is dark shadows, right? Those really deep dark shadows that have no detail, those heavy blacks. That's what you're trying to avoid. And when you're in a situation like this, you can actually start shooting earlier in the evening, or you can shoot later into the morning because you get a lot of reflection off that sand and that water. But at any rate, just to give you an idea how nice and sharp this shot is, you can see his eye is looking very, very good right there. And even this one looks very, very nice and sharp over here. And so they had to be very, very close to the same focal plane, at least the eyes were. So that I just tickled pink that I was lucky enough to get it tickled pink because of the flamingos. Hopefully you'll keep watching after that. So no video talking about photography in the Galapagos is complete without at least one marine iguana in the mix. And this is definitely my favorite marine iguana shot. This is a kind of Christmas color phase Marine iguana, they get their coloration from what they eat. A lot of them are just black, but this guy, whatever he's eating, helps get that pigmentation in his skin. He looks fantastic. And what I really like about it is that he is like walking right towards the camera. And if you notice, his front foot and his back foot are both up in the air. So he's only on 2 feet. And he looks like he is either happy to see me or about to eat me. I don't know which one, but it was really, really a neat experience. And as you can see, this was a little bit farther back. This was at 600 millimeter. So that's the 300-8 and the teleconverter, 1/1250th of a second, f5.6 and ISO 1600. And -1 EV. And the reason for the -1 is all of that black rock. When your camera sees a lot of black rock like that, or anything really dark in tonality, it tends to want to overexpose. So we have to tell it, nope, we don't want you to overexpose. We want it to be a little bit darker. So that's where I ended up at -1 here. And as far as the shutter speed, it worked out pretty well. I did have a few of these. He was moving fast enough, believe it or not, that at 1/1250th of a second, that there were some that actually showed some blur, although I'm not sure if that was from his movement or because we were on a dinghy and it's moving around. So once again, we're talking about, shooting from a dinghy. And once again, we're talking about you need more shutter speed. It was a little bit dark here though at ISO 1600. So I was kind of trying to balance what I needed with how rough it was and how much the motor was vibrating and all that. So 1250 is pretty good. I probably could have gone another third of a step to 1600 and ISO 2000. That would have been okay too here, especially with reptiles. One thing I've noticed about reptiles, if you're ever shooting reptiles, they denoise really, really well because they don't have like the super, super fine detail you see on birds. I find that with reptiles, I can go a little bit higher with my ISOs and still get a very pleasant rendering after denoising. But yeah, otherwise, the other thing to remember when you are shooting on a boat is to shoot heavy. And that's what I did here. As he was coming up, I'm at 20 frames a second for an iguana. And he's coming towards me. And I'm just laying into it. And again, because I'm on a boat, I have a lot of movement. So I know that some of those are going to be throwaways. So I always shoot heavier on a boat. But the other reason to do that in a situation like this is because even though he doesn't appear to be a super fast action subject, so many times when I have slower subjects that are walking or just strolling towards me like this guy's doing, you'd be surprised. Guess how many photos had the feet perfectly up like this out of that 20 frames? If you guessed one, you're correct. So a lot of times people will question, they'll say, Steve, why do you always have your camera at such high frame rates, 20 or 30 frames a second? This is why. Because even with slower or even sometimes with static subjects that are making a movement with their head or whatever, you'll find you'll have instances where you still have just one photo that's absolutely got the positioning that you want and the other ones were not quite there. So one of my favorite species in the Galapagos is the Sally Lightfoot crab. They're not endemic. They're found in other places as well. But in the Galapagos, you get them up against these black volcanic rocks. They just look fantastic. Those reds really pop. They really look like what you see in the photo here. They're so colorful. They have that light blue bottom. They have kind of those purplish eyes. And of course, the bright red crab claws and legs and stuff. So really, really nice contrast when it's put up against those black lava rocks. And it's interesting because I was photographing something else and I noticed some people from the group were over looking at this little crab over there. So I ran over. So the group actually found this one before I did. And I'm glad they did. It's such a neat opportunity. This is one, we were on a beach, so I got all the way down. I'm on my belly, and subject detection doesn't work. And one of the things I tell people with subject detection, you've probably heard me say this before, is if it's not working, switch to something else. So basically what I did here, I used a medium spot AF area and just put it on his eye as best I could. I focused right there. You can see it's nice and sharp. And I did stop down to f8 here to get a little more depth of field here. So he's a little bit sharper because he is kind of on a little bit of an angle. And you can see he has a 420 millimeters. So, f8's not going to get me, sharpness from all the way, to the background, but it, gives you acceptable sharpness across the board there. 1/250th of a second, ISO 2500. So he was in a dark little area here. You can tell by those settings, but crabs are one of those subjects that actually take noise reduction really well. And if you look, it looks very, very clean here after some noise reduction there. He looks very nice. I really like the way this worked out. Again, I'm all the way down on my belly. I'm using that single spot right on his eye there. And we all had a really great time photographing this guy. But I really like how the light looks like it's coming in here from the right-hand side and how it kind of opens up here so your eye just kind of wants to go down to the crab. And, this keeps you, kind of this blurry foreground kind of keeps your attention there too. So he looks like he's just kind of hiding out there. So anyhow, pretty cool. So, of course, one of the species that we have to think about in the Galapagos are the blue-footed boobies. Everybody knows about the blue-footed boobies. Galapagos is famous for them, so you definitely need a few shots here. And I think this is probably one of my favorites out of the trip. I really like that he's displaying there and that she's looking over at him. I was at a decent angle there, so we have a nice profile shot of his face there, and you can really see his wings. And just a couple of notes, though. He was doing this over and over, so I had multiple chances to get the shot. And I'm going to tell you some of my mistakes, some of the things I learned here. So first, I'm always trying to position myself so I don't have any overlap with subjects. If you notice, we have a nice gap here. If that beak was over the wing, would not have been a workable shot for me. So that's something I'm always looking for. So when you're positioning yourself, you have to think about that. If you notice, I'm also using the 100 to 400 here. And that was because I was fairly close to them and I couldn't get back any farther. So, I know I've been a lot of this video is showcasing the Sony 300-2.8 with and without teleconverters, but there are times you definitely need something shorter because I could have gotten back a little bit farther with these guys and used the 300, but the reason I didn't was it was going uphill. So then I'd be shooting down on them with a 300. So sometimes you really do need that shorter focal length, something like a 100 to 400. And a lot of our guests were using that lens with a great deal of success. So definitely a highly recommended lens, regardless of which system you're using. But in any event, going back to this particular composition, one of the challenges here was, of course, to make sure everything was sharp. So I was at 1600th of a second. I needed enough depth of field to keep reasonable focus on both of the birds. So I was shooting at f8, and if we zoom into 100%, you can see he is absolutely tack sharp. And this is very, very sharp over here. I don't think it's quite as sharp as this, but it's still in the realm of acceptability for a wildlife shot, considering that this is the main subject. ISO, because of that, was at 2500, but as you can see, it noise reduced really, really well. And if you want to learn how to do noise reduction, remember to check out my noise reduction masterclass video for free here on YouTube. One of the lessons I learned here the hard way, though, and this is something that we often encounter when we're photographing new things, right, is that we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And every time he did this, for the first 2 or 3 shots, I would cut these wingtips off over here on the right-hand side. Every single time he would bring his wings up and I had the composition wrong every single time. I was in too tight because it fit both the birds without him doing that without any problem. So it's one of those things that, when you're in a new place, sometimes you have to go through a little bit of a learning curve to kind of realize what's happening. And this is why when you're photographing something new, it's so important that if the opportunity is there, to chimp a little bit, look at the back LCD, look at your results, and see if you like what you're seeing, especially with a new subject, because there might be something like that. I thought I had the shots. So when I chimped, though, and I saw that I was just clipping that wing, I made sure that I zoomed back out and I adjusted things so that next time I wouldn't do it. I still managed to do it 2 or 3 times, but you get the idea. Because anytime you're doing something new, there could be something unexpected. And had I not noticed that initially there, I may have clipped all of the wings in all of the shots and not been able to show you this photo. So just something to think about when you're photographing a new subject. But again, don't chimp at the expense of getting shots. But when you have those little breaks, it doesn't hurt to just quickly glance through and make sure you like everything that you're seeing. So, of course, one of the major species in the Galapagos are the tortoise. They're famous for it. And this is a dome-shaped tortoise. This is just a headshot of him. And the reason that I like to do stuff like this is I tell my workshop participants the same thing. Try to take photos of things that don't look like they belong in a field guide. We don't want just this typical standing in the grass, taking a photo of your subject. We want to have something interesting, something that shows the viewer a different aspect of the subject, something that emphasizes things like this shot shows how wrinkled and detailed and scaly his face is. This also allowed me to do one of my favorite tricks. I got down really low. I was on my belly for this. You can see that that's kind of a theme here. And I was down really low, but I had a nice cool background with this grass. And he's nice and warm. And interestingly, cool colors recede and warm colors come forward. So that allows you to get a little bit more pop, a little more 3-dimension in your images if you can find a mix like this. So his head is really popping off that green background very nicely because of that difference in color. This was with a 100 to 400 at 400 millimeter. And if you notice, I left it at 5.6. I didn't close it down at all. I had thought about stopping down, but the reason I left it at 5.6 was that 5.6 was enough to get the detail right here in his face, which is where I want the viewer to look. Sharper areas, areas that are more contrasty, also draw the viewer in so that your eye wants to go there. and it let it kind of gradually fall off with his neck here, but you can still see the detail. But the big thing was this arm that we have right in front of his face. Because if I would have stopped down to F8 or F11 and had a little more definition here in the arm, suddenly this is going to become a distraction. All those scales are going to compete. All that contrast is going to compete for your attention with his face. And I didn't want that. I wanted this to stay nice and soft, so I left it at F5.6. Between that and being on my belly, that had the added benefit of completely blurring out most of that background for me. So this is another one of my favorite sea lion shots, and this guy is coming right at the camera and he's kind of porpoising towards me. And if you're looking at the shot saying, gee, it looks like you were just standing in the ocean or kneeling in the ocean with your 300 and A1, you're correct. That's exactly what I was doing. I was kneeling there in the water as he was coming towards me, and then as he would get towards me, I would get out of his way so he could keep going and, without me impeding him in any way, shape, or form. But then I would get on the beach and I would run down to get in front of him again, and then I get back out in the water, kneel down again, and as he was coming, I would get him porpoising towards the camera. And the hit rate with this was a little bit low. So I didn't get a ton of these because, a lot of times he's underwater, then he's up and he's down, there's water splashing, there's all sorts of things for the camera to lock onto. So it was a little bit of a difficult shot. And on top of it, my camera's about this high above the waves. And I have to be very aware of what's going on as the waves are coming in. There was a lot of times where I couldn't get the shot because there was a big wave coming in. I just had to stand up and make sure that the camera was safe. So it was a very risky shot because, if the wave were to go over a Sony 300 and a A1, you could probably use it as a paperweight afterwards. That would be the end of it. So you have to be very, very careful in this situation. But, in the end, it worked out pretty well. 1/4000th of a second because I knew he was coming very fast. I needed to stop that motion. I stopped down to F4.5 for a little bit of extra depth of field there to give myself a little bit of a fudge factor there. And you can see it worked out nice and sharp. If you look at his fur and his head here, everything's nice and sharp. We have some water over his eyes, which kind of give it a little bit of soft appearance. You can see the water sheeting off of him there. But if you look at the whiskers and the fur here, you can see it's very, very sharp. ISO 640, so, I did a little noise reduction, but not much. The trickiest part here was I had to brighten up some of the area here on the right because it was a little bit in the shadow there because it was a pretty bright day. But regardless, this worked out really, really well. But if you do try to do something like this, you have to be so, so careful not to get your camera destroyed in the process. It came close a couple of times, but fortunately I was able to keep it out of the way. And of course you need to stay out of the sea lion's way too as he's making his way down the beach. So here is my Galapagos penguin. I'm really, really happy with this shot. I love the way it turned out. You can see he's in the rain. One of the tricks with rain is you need a dark background, and we were in the zodiac, so there's only so much you could do about that. But thankfully, from this particular position, it was nothing but black lava rock behind him, so you can really see the rain standing out against that. If you want to have rain in the shots, you want that rain to show up, you have to have a darker background, middle tone or darker, preferably darker. And black is ideal, so you can really see the rain coming down here. And this was from a Zodiac. So this was difficult. It was very rocky, very windy, very rainy. And it didn't start off that way though. Well, it did start off rocky, but it didn't start off raining. It had been raining and it stopped and we thought, oh, it's done. Well, I thought that it was done. And we were going to go look for these penguins. And I thought, okay, you know what? I want to go light because the Zodiacs are tight. They're crowded. And what I want to do is just go with the 300 and a couple of teleconverters. That'll be fine. So that was the plan. And I did not think it was going to start raining, so I left my camera bag that had my rain sleeve for the camera back on the boat. So we go out, and of course, naturally, after we start photographing these penguins, it starts raining. And those, of course, are the shots that I really want, are the ones in the rain. So I'm out there, I'm using it without a rain sleeve at first because it's not raining too terribly hard. But as the rain got harder, I was starting to get concerned, so I grabbed a towel. So anything you can put over the camera to kind of help keep the rain from sitting directly on it can help. And that worked out for me for this shot. Obviously, you see that, the camera survived and the shot worked out. I was at 1600th of a second. I wanted to go slower because the slower you go with rain, the longer the drops are. But the problem was I wasn't willing to roll those dice. The boat was really rocking, so I was concerned that if I was at too slow of a shutter speed, I wasn't going to get the shot. In addition, it was very difficult just to keep a composition in the viewfinder. As the boat's bouncing up and down, I'm at 420 millimeter, and I'd see the shot and I'd lay on it anytime I saw the shot, but it comes and goes as the boat's bouncing. So it's like you have a limited window there, a limited opportunity where you can keep the camera fixed on your subject and actually fire the shutter and get something that resembles a composition. So it was very, very challenging overall, but in the end, it worked out. So I kept it at 1600th of a second to make sure that I had enough shutter speed to keep everything nice and sharp. And if I zoom in here, you can see very nice and sharp. We see lots of great detail right there. And f4 wide open because it was pretty dark, ISO 2000, and I'll tell you what, I had to bump this up by almost a stop, so I should have been at a little bit higher ISO. I was in full manual mode for this, and I'm looking in the viewfinder. Again, you got to remember the wind's blowing, the rain's blowing, you know, everything is hectic, the boat is bouncing up and down, and in the viewfinder everything looked fine, but I should have looked at it a little bit harder and bumped that ISO up. In the end, though, it doesn't really make much of a difference. It's an ISO invariant sensor. I can bring it up in Lightroom and it's going to look the same as had I shot it at ISO, 3200 or whatever out there in the field. But regardless, I was able to get the shot. As you can see, noise reduction worked really well. It looks really nice and smooth, nice and sharp. So, but in the end, I ended up with a shot, which is great because it's one of the species I was after, and I got the bonus of actually capturing it in the rain. So there you have it. If you enjoyed the video, if you learned something today, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to join us on a future Galapagos workshop, make sure you sign up for my free email newsletter so you're alerted when those kind of things happen. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.